It was rough. Musicians union was there, but they weren't of much help at the time. I was never happy. I guess what drives me to tear things apart.
There are musicians who play guitar, and then there are musicians who become the guitar. Edward Ludwig Van Halen was undeniably the latter. From the moment he walked onto a stage in the late 1970s, he didn't just play an instrument. He redefined what the instrument could do, what it could say, and what it could feel like in human hands. He was technically ferocious, emotionally raw, and creatively restless in ways that few artists in any genre ever managed to sustain across an entire career. But here's the thing about Eddie Van Halen that most casual fans never fully understood. Beneath that wide, infectious grin and behind those volcanic solos lived a deeply sensitive man. A man who carried wounds from the very people who inspired him. A man who could forgive easily but forget almost never. He was not built for bitterness, yet certain encounters, certain dismissals, certain moments of artistic theft or cold-shouldered arrogance from his peers left marks that lasted decades. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 6 guitarists who, for one reason or another, found themselves on the wrong side of Eddie Van Halen's respect. This isn't a story of manufactured celebrity drama. It's something far more human, the story of a genius who wanted nothing more than to be understood by the people he admired most, and what happened when that understanding never came. Let's begin. Before we talk about tension, we have to talk about worship. Because that is where this story truly begins. In the mid-1960s, a young boy named Eddie Van Halen sat in a bedroom in Pasadena, California, surrounded by records that felt like sacred objects. At the top of that stack were Cream albums, those explosive, improvisational slabs of British blues rock featuring a guitarist that the entire world had already crowned with a nickname that said everything: God. Eric Clapton. For Eddie, Clapton wasn't an influence in the casual sense of the word. He was the reason. The reason to pick up a guitar. The reason to practice until his fingers ached. The reason to believe that 6 strings and a wooden body could be turned into something that made people feel genuinely alive. He spent countless hours dissecting Clapton's solo on Crossroads, learning every bend, every vibrato, every deliberate pause. He wasn't just copying. He was studying a philosophy of sound. What Clapton taught him, without ever meeting him, was that emotion was the architecture of great guitar playing. Tone wasn't just a technical setting, it was a feeling. Phrasing wasn't just timing, it was storytelling. Eddie absorbed all of this and let it ferment deep in his musical DNA. Then came 1978, and everything changed. Van Halen's debut album landed like a thunderclap. Eruption, that barely 2-minute instrumental that Eddie almost didn't include on the record, didn't just impress people. It frightened them. Musicians who had been playing for 20 years suddenly felt like beginners. Guitarists slowed down their record players trying to understand what they were hearing. Critics scrambled for language to describe something that genuinely had no precedent. Eddie Van Halen had done something extraordinary. He had built on everything that came before him and then leaped so far beyond it that the leap itself became the story. And somewhere in England, his hero Eric Clapton was listening. The response, when it came, was not what Eddie had hoped for. Clapton, in a 1980 interview, was asked about the Van Halen phenomenon. His answer was polite in the most devastating way possible. He acknowledged Eddie's technical ability and then added that he didn't hear much soul in the playing. He described it as impressive but somehow mechanical, more exercise than expression. For most musicians, a lukewarm review from a peer would sting and then fade. For Eddie, this was something altogether different. This was his hero. The man whose records had been his education, his inspiration, his entire reason for picking up a guitar in the first place. To be dismissed by him wasn't criticism, it was betrayal. Not an intentional betrayal, perhaps, but a rejection that cut to the bone regardless. Friends who were close to Eddie during that period recalled that he didn't rage about it publicly. He didn't fire back in interviews or manufacture a public feud. Instead, he went quiet on the subject. He carried it. He admitted years later that it genuinely broke his heart, that he had never been trying to outshine Clapton or prove anything to him. He had simply been trying to honor the feeling that Clapton's music had given him, translated through his own hands and his own imagination. To hear that this had failed to register felt like being told that something he loved deeply had no value. The philosophical divide between them was real, and it ran deeper than personal feeling. Clapton's approach to guitar was rooted in the blues tradition, restrained, deliberate, deeply emotional in a contained way. His tone was warm and his phrasing was unhurried. He believed in saying less and meaning more. Eddie's approach was the opposite: boundless, explosive, technically fearless, and thrillingly chaotic. Where Clapton painted in watercolors, Eddie was spraying paint directly from the can with the cap off. These weren't just different styles. They were different philosophies about what music was supposed to do and what it was supposed to say. And the generational gap between them made full understanding almost impossible from either direction. The two men did eventually meet, in Los Angeles sometime in the mid-1980s. Eddie approached that meeting the way a devoted fan approaches a long-dreamed-of encounter with their idol, with hope, with nervous energy, with something approaching reverence. What he found was a polite and somewhat distant man who spoke about gear and tone and amplifiers. Perfectly pleasant. Completely impersonal. Afterwards, Eddie reportedly told a close friend that he had spent his whole life loving a myth, and that the myth was more powerful than the man had turned out to be. That moment was quietly transformative. It was when Eddie Van Halen stopped seeing legendary musicians as something beyond human. It was also when he started to make peace with Clapton's assessment. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. He came to understand that two people could both love the guitar passionately and still occupy completely different creative universes. By 2001, he was able to say publicly that if Clapton had never existed, neither would he, and that nothing Clapton thought of him could change that fundamental truth. The admiration, in other words, never died. It just grew up. If Eric Clapton represented the warm, blues-drenched heart of Eddie's early musical education, then Ritchie Blackmore represented the dark, dramatic, classically inflected soul of it. The guitarist behind Deep Purple and later Rainbow was a figure of genuine mystique, brooding, technically formidable, and surrounded by an aura of cold intensity that made him seem less like a rock musician and more like a medieval sorcerer who had wandered into the 20th century with a Stratocaster. Eddie was obsessed with him. He studied tracks like Burn and Highway Star with the same forensic dedication he brought to Clapton's work, breaking down every solo, every run, every moment of controlled aggression. What fascinated him about Blackmore was the sense of structure beneath the fire, solos that felt simultaneously spontaneous and inevitable, like they had been composed by fate rather than rehearsed by a human being. When Van Halen broke through in 1978, Eddie found himself suddenly sharing festival bills and industry spaces with the men he had idolized from his bedroom floor. And when he finally encountered Ritchie Blackmore in person, the result was crushing. Blackmore, by multiple accounts including Eddie's own recollections, simply stared at him. No greeting. No acknowledgement. No warmth of any kind. Just a cold, blank gaze that communicated, whether intentionally or not, complete indifference. For someone as genuinely open and socially warm as Eddie Van Halen, a man who could spend hours with complete strangers talking about pickup configurations and amp wiring, who laughed easily and never performed his own importance, this kind of deliberate coldness was almost incomprehensible. He couldn't understand how someone who loved the guitar as deeply as Blackmore clearly did could be so unwilling to share even a moment of human connection with a fellow player. Years later, Blackmore offered a public assessment of Eddie's playing that managed to be simultaneously a compliment and a dismissal. His verdict was that Eddie played too many notes, a critique rooted in the classical tradition that prizes economy and deliberateness above all else. For Blackmore, a solo was a sentence, and sentences should not be padded with unnecessary words. For Eddie, a solo was more like a conversation that didn't want to stop, fluid, overlapping, full of ideas chasing each other across the fretboard. Neither approach was wrong. They were simply the products of two entirely different musical languages. What's remarkable is how little bitterness Eddie held on to. In a 1995 Guitar World interview, he looked back on the coldness of those early encounters and wondered aloud if he had simply been too sensitive, if perhaps Blackmore was shy in ways that didn't translate well, if maybe the blank stare had been discomfort rather than disdain. It was a remarkably charitable reappraisal from a man who had every right to feel genuinely hurt. And eventually, Ritchie Blackmore did say the words that mattered. In a 2008 interview with Classic Rock magazine, he acknowledged that Eddie Van Halen had brought something genuinely new to the instrument, that his approach to the whammy bar, his tapping technique, and his overall sound represented a real creative discovery, not just a technical gimmick. He called it clever. He said Eddie had found his own voice. It wasn't an apology, but it was recognition. And for Eddie Van Halen, who had wanted nothing more than to be understood by the people he most admired, it was enough. The year is 1978, and Van Halen is on the road for the first time as a nationally recognized act. The debut album is everywhere. Radio stations are playing it. Record stores can't keep it stocked. And Eddie Van Halen, 23 years old, is doing what he was born to do every single night, tearing through solos that left audiences physically stunned, playing with a joy and ferocity that felt almost supernatural. But behind the spectacle, something was quietly eating at him. Because touring meant sharing spaces with other musicians, and some of those musicians were men whose work had shaped everything he understood about the electric guitar. Joe Perry of Aerosmith was one of them, a cornerstone player of 1970s American hard rock, a man whose riff-heavy, swaggering style had helped define the sound of a generation. When Eddie finally crossed paths with Perry in those early touring days, the response he received was, by his own account, silence. Not the comfortable silence of mutual understanding, but the pointed silence of deliberate dismissal. No hello. No acknowledgement. Just that particular kind of studied indifference that communicates, more clearly than any insult, that you have been evaluated and found unworthy of attention. Eddie described it in a 1982 interview with Guitar Player magazine as being given the shaft with the eyes. It's a vivid and painful phrase, the idea that contempt can be delivered without a single word, that a glance can close a door more firmly than any argument. He had not been asking for mentorship or validation. He had been asking for the basic human dignity of recognition from a peer. His assessment of why it happened was unsentimental and probably accurate. The late 1970s represented a genuine generational rupture in rock guitar. The style that Perry represented, thick, blues-rooted, groove-oriented, built on swagger and attitude, was being challenged by a new approach that Eddie himself embodied. Fast, precise, technically innovative, and rooted in a completely different sonic aesthetic. It made sense that players invested in the old approach would feel threatened by the new one. Understanding that, however, didn't make the cold shoulder any less painful to receive. What is striking, in retrospect, is how Joe